The evening light filtered through the expansive windows of Bayside Grill, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Located in the upscale district of Tampa, Florida, the restaurant had established itself as the gathering place for the city's elite, a carefully cultivated atmosphere of exclusivity and refinement. Terry Bollea, better known to millions around the world as Hulk Hogan, adjusted his signature bandana as he approached the host stand, his imposing 6'7" frame drawing subtle glances from nearby diners despite his attempt at a low-profile entrance. The reservation had been arranged weeks in advance, a strategic business dinner with potential investors who could help launch his newest venture, a fitness brand aimed at the over 50 demographic. After decades in the spotlight, Terry had learned to navigate the complex terrain between his public persona and his private business endeavors. Tonight was about the latter, a careful separation he maintained with increasing diligence as he aged out of the wrestling spotlight and into the more nuanced world of entrepreneurship. "Reservation for Bollea, party of 4, he said, his voice carrying that distinctive gravel that had become synonymous with his wrestling persona. Though he had consciously softened its theatrical edge for this setting, the host, a young man in his 20s with meticulously styled hair and a tailored black suit, glanced up from his tablet. Recognition flashed across his face, that inevitable moment Terry had experienced countless times throughout his career. But this time, something else followed: discomfort, hesitation. The young man's eyes darted toward a woman in a charcoal gray suit who appeared to be the manager, before leaning toward her and whispering something inaudible against the background of ambient conversation and carefully selected jazz. The manager's expression shifted from neutral to concerned as she nodded and stepped forward, smoothing her jacket in what appeared to be a nervous gesture. "Mr. Bollea," she began, her voice measured but firm. "I'm Regina Winters, the general manager here at Bayside. I'm afraid there's been a situation. We received specific instructions from ownership this morning that we cannot accommodate you in our establishment tonight." The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Terry's companions, his business partner, Mark Silverstein, who had been with him through 3 decades of career evolution, and 2 potential investors, James Henderson and Sophia Choi, exchanged uncomfortable glances. The carefully orchestrated evening was unraveling before it had begun. "There must be some mistake," Terry replied, lowering his voice to avoid drawing further attention. The practiced control that had governed his public appearances for years automatically engaged. "We confirmed this reservation 3 days ago. We're here to discuss a business opportunity." Regina maintained her professional demeanor, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the difficulty of her position. "I understand this is inconvenient, Mr. Bollea. However, following your recent public statements regarding the ownership's family, they've exercised their right to refuse service. I apologize, but this decision comes directly from Mr. Alessandri himself." The name registered immediately in Terry's mind. Dominic Alessandri, the restaurant's owner and real estate developer, had been engaged in a heated community dispute over development rights near Terry's beachfront property, a controversy that had spilled into local news when Terry had criticized Alessandri's business practices during a community meeting last month. The proposed development would potentially block public access to a stretch of beach that had been freely accessible for generations, something Terry had publicly opposed as both a homeowner and a lifelong advocate for public recreational spaces. What had seemed like a routine community disagreement had apparently festered into something more personal. Terry felt a familiar heat rise in his neck, the same sensation that had preceded countless theatrical confrontations in the ring. But this wasn't the squared circle with its scripted outcomes and choreographed conflicts. This was his actual life, with real stakes and witnesses armed with smartphone cameras. Mark stepped forward, his voice low and measured as he attempted to negotiate. "Surely we can resolve this misunderstanding. The investors have flown in specifically for this meeting." Perhaps we could speak directly with Mr. Alessandri? I'm sorry, Regina replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. Mr. Alessandri was quite clear in his instructions. I can recommend several establishments nearby that might accommodate your party on short notice. Terry felt the familiar heat of public scrutiny as nearby diners began to notice the exchange. Conversations quieted, and the inevitable emergence of phones from pockets and purses confirmed what he already knew. This moment would be documented, shared, and dissected on social media within the hour. What had been intended as a private business dinner was transforming into yet another public spectacle, the kind he had been strategically trying to distance himself from in recent years. He had built a career on knowing when to amplify conflict and when to strategically retreat. This moment called for the latter. Creating a scene would only feed into the narrative that Alessandri likely hoped to establish, that of an aging celebrity unable to separate himself from his confrontational public persona. "Thank you for your time," he said finally, his voice controlled despite the flush of embarrassment warming his face. He turned to his companions, particularly Henderson and Choi, whose first impression of him as a business partner was being shaped by this unexpected rejection. "Let's go." As they exited the restaurant, moving through the carefully manicured entrance where a valet stood at attention, Terry was acutely aware of the optics. The theater of rejection playing out for an audience of Tampa's elite and, soon, for the much larger audience of social media. He felt the weight of his companions' uncertainty, the potential investors' recalculation of their interest in his brand, and his own internal struggle between the instinct to respond with the bombastic flair of his wrestling days and the measured restraint he had been cultivating in his business persona. "There's a steakhouse 2 blocks down," Mark offered as they reached the sidewalk, already scrolling through his phone for alternatives. "I can call ahead." Terry nodded, but his mind was already processing beyond dinner arrangements. He was weighing his options, considering the angles, and formulating how to transform this public rejection into something entirely unexpected, not just for Alessandri, but for the community that was watching. Throughout his career, he had mastered the art of turning setbacks into opportunities, of redirecting narratives and reframing defeats. This situation, despite its personal sting, was presenting a canvas for something beyond a simple restaurant dispute. "Make the call," he said to Mark, his gaze fixed on the Tampa skyline stretching beyond the restaurant district. "But tomorrow, we're going to respond to this, just not in the way anyone would expect." Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terry's Gulfront home, illuminating the space where he had spent most of his life plotting career moves and public appearances. The house itself was a testament to decades of strategic decision-making. Situated on one of the most coveted stretches of Florida coastline, it represented not just financial success, but the careful cultivation of a legacy beyond the wrestling ring. He sat at the kitchen island, methodically scrolling through his phone, absorbing the digital aftermath of the previous evening. As expected, local news outlets had already picked up the story. Wrestling legend denied service at upscale Tampa restaurant. Social media buzzed with varying accounts, some painting him as the victim of pettiness, others speculating about what he might have done to deserve such treatment. The narrative was still fluid, still malleable, exactly the state where Terry had learned, through decades in the public eye, that intervention was most effective. Mark paced behind him, coffee in hand, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of stress. "The Henderson Group called this morning. They're reassessing the partnership opportunity in light of yesterday's events," he reported, setting his cup down with more force than necessary. "This is a PR nightmare for the investment deal. Henderson and Choi are still interested, but they're concerned about associating with controversy." Terry set his phone down, thoughtful. The morning sunlight caught the silver in his beard, a physical reminder of the years that had passed since his peak wrestling fame, years that had taught him that public perception was a fluid thing, capable of dramatic shifts with the right approach. He had weathered controversies far more significant than a restaurant rejection, rebuilding his image multiple times throughout a career that spanned generations of fans. "This isn't about Alessandri's restaurant or even about me," he said finally, moving to stand at the expansive windows that overlooked the coastline, the same stretch of beach that Alessandri's proposed development threatened to restrict. "It's about the community issue that started this, the development that would remove access to the public beach." He traced the shoreline with his eyes, watching the early morning joggers and dog walkers freely enjoying the space that had become the center of the dispute. The previous night's rejection had been personal, but the underlying issue affected thousands of Tampa residents who had no personal quarrel with Alessandri, only a desire to preserve access to natural spaces. "What if we pivot?" he continued, turning back to Mark. "Instead of fighting Alessandri directly, we create something positive, something that addresses the real issue while changing the narrative." Mark raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee down. "I'm listening." Over the next several hours, the Gulf Front home transformed into a makeshift command center. Terry made calls to local business owners, community organizers, environmental advocates, and former colleagues in the entertainment industry. Each conversation built upon the previous one, pieces of a strategic response taking shape with each connection. By afternoon, Terry and Mark sat amidst scattered notepads and empty coffee cups. A plan crystallized before them, one that would transform the public embarrassment into an opportunity for community engagement. "We're going to host a community fundraiser," Terry explained, as they finalized the details, his voice carrying the same conviction that had once rallied wrestling fans, now channeled into civic engagement. Not just any fundraiser, a coastal conservation initiative focused on preserving public beach access. "We'll invite local restaurants to participate, offering a sampling of their menus with a portion of proceeds going to a newly established conservation fund." "And what's our time frame?" Mark asked, already making notes. "Saturday," Terry replied without hesitation. 4 days from now. Enough time to organize, but soon enough to maintain connection to the incident. We'll hold it at the public park beside the beach that's under threat." "And Alessandri's restaurant?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. "I assume they're not on the invitation list." "They're at the top of the invitation list," Terry replied, a hint of his strategic showmanship emerging. "We'll invite every restaurant in the district, including Bayside. If they accept, they're supporting the cause they've been fighting against. If they decline, they're the only establishment not participating in a community benefit." Mark leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face as he recognized the elegant construction of the response. "That's actually brilliant. It completely reframes the narrative." By evening, the announcement went live on Terry's social media accounts, accompanied by a professionally produced video shot against the backdrop of the threatened beach. "Join me this Saturday for Open Shores, a community fundraiser celebrating our right to access Florida's beautiful coastlines. Local restaurants, entertainment, and conversation about preserving what makes Tampa special." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations requested interviews, community members offered to volunteer, and restaurants began confirming their participation. The narrative was shifting from a story about a celebrity being denied service to a community rallying around environmental conservation and public access. Terry watched the responses flood in, the digital engagement metrics climbing with each hour. In his home office, he fielded calls from reporters with measured responses, careful to focus on the initiative rather than the incident that sparked it. "This isn't about one restaurant or one person," he repeated consistently. "It's about ensuring that future generations can enjoy the natural beauty that belongs to all of us." To a particularly persistent reporter who pressed about the timing in relation to the Bayside incident, Terry offered a carefully crafted response. "Sometimes rejection opens doors to better possibilities. This isn't about where I can or can't eat dinner. It's about where every Tampa resident can or can't access the coastline that defines our community." As he concluded his final interview of the day, he received a message from Henderson, one of the investors who had witnessed the restaurant incident. "Impressive pivot. Our meeting is still on, and we're bringing additional interested parties." Mark read the message over Terry's shoulder. "Looks like your strategy is already paying dividends." Terry nodded. But his focus had already shifted beyond the investment potential. There was something unexpectedly fulfilling about channeling his public platform toward community benefit, a different kind of performance than the one that had defined his early career, but one that carried its own satisfaction. "It's not just about changing the narrative," he admitted. "It's about using this platform for something that matters." The beach access issue affects thousands of people who don't have the voice or platform to fight developers like Alessandri. As twilight descended over the Gulf, casting long shadows across the contested shoreline, Terry stood on his deck, watching the waves. The restaurant rejection had been meant to diminish him, to exercise power over his public image. Instead, it had created an opening for something more significant than a business dinner, a chance to demonstrate that influence could be used for community benefit rather than personal advancement. Tomorrow would bring logistical challenges, potential pushback, and the complex task of coordinating dozens of moving pieces into a cohesive event. But tonight, watching the same tides that had witnessed his entire career ebb and flow, Terry felt a clarity of purpose that transcended the initial sting of rejection. The narrative was no longer in Alessandri's control. It had been reclaimed, redirected, and repurposed for impact beyond a single evening's embarrassment. The Saturday of the Open Shores event arrived with perfect weather, clear skies stretching endlessly above Tampa Bay, and a gentle breeze carrying the salt scent of the Gulf across the beachfront park where volunteers had been setting up since dawn. What had begun as an idea just days earlier had materialized into a sprawling community gathering. Food trucks and pop-up tents from local restaurants lined the perimeter, their banners fluttering in the breeze. A modest stage stood ready for the afternoon's speakers and entertainment, while information booths staffed by environmental organizations distributed literature about coastal conservation efforts. Terry arrived early, dressed casually in a t-shirt bearing the Open Shores logo, a silhouette of the coastline with the words "Preserving Access for All" beneath it. The design had been created by a local artist who had volunteered her services after hearing about the initiative, one of dozens of community members who had stepped forward to contribute their talents. He moved through the growing crowd, shaking hands and thanking participants, his camera-ready persona softened by genuine engagement with the volunteers and early attendees. "Mr. Hogan, Mr. Bollier," called a young woman approaching with a clipboard, her quick correction acknowledging the distinction between his public character and private identity that he had been navigating throughout his career. "I'm Elena Vasquez from the Coastal Conservation Coalition. We've had over 200 people pre-register to volunteer for beach cleanups because of this event. That's more than double our usual response rate." "That's what it's all about," Terry replied, the satisfaction evident in his voice as he surveyed the growing crowd. The rejection at Bayside Grill felt distant now, overshadowed by the tangible community response unfolding before him. "And please, call me Terry." Eleanor nodded, her clipboard tucked against her chest. "I have to admit, when we first heard about this event, we were skeptical. Celebrity involvement can sometimes be more about optics than actual impact. But what you've mobilized here in just a few days, this is real engagement." Her candor was refreshing, a reminder that his motivations were being assessed not just by the media, but by the very community organizations whose work intersected with the initiative. Terry had learned through years of public scrutiny that authenticity resonated far more powerfully than performance, especially outside the entertainment arena. "Sometimes the most effective advocacy comes from unexpected places," he offered. "I've lived on this coastline for decades. Its preservation matters to me not as a celebrity, but as a resident who wants future generations to enjoy what we sometimes take for granted. As the event gained momentum, families spread blankets on the grass, children darted between food stalls, and conversations about environmental policy mingled with more casual community connections. Local news crews arrived, capturing footage of the festivities and interviewing restaurant owners about their participation. The narrative had completely transformed, no longer about a celebrity being denied service, but about a community uniting around a shared value. Many of the participating restaurants had created special dishes for the occasion, featuring sustainable seafood and locally sourced ingredients. The culinary showcase had evolved beyond Terry's initial concept, with chefs embracing the theme and competing informally for the most creative interpretation of coastal cuisine. What might have been a simple sampling had become a celebration of regional culinary identity, another layer of community engagement that transcended the incident that had sparked it all. Terry found himself drawn into conversations about marine conservation, public land access policies, and the economic impact of environmental protection, dialogues far removed from the entertainment world where his public image had been forged. There was something liberating about engaging with issues that extended beyond personal brand, about using his platform to amplify voices that might otherwise struggle to break through the noise of public discourse. Midway through the afternoon, as a local band performed an acoustic set on the main stage, an unexpected figure appeared at the perimeter of the event. Regina Winters, the manager from Bayside Grill, accompanied by a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and an Italian linen suit that stood out amidst the casual attire of the event attendees. Terry immediately recognized him as Dominic Alessandri, the restaurant owner and developer whose proposed project had sparked the entire chain of events. Mark noticed them simultaneously, moving to Terry's side with the practiced ease of someone who had managed potential confrontations throughout their long professional association. "Didn't expect to see them here," he murmured, assessing the situation with the calculation of a seasoned public relations strategist. "Want me to have security escort them out? It would be justified after what happened at Bayside." Terry considered the opportunity presented. The symmetry was tempting, to refuse entry to those who had refused him, to exercise the same power over Alessandri that had been wielded against him. It would provide a certain narrative satisfaction, a clean resolution to the conflict that had begun at the restaurant. But it would also undermine the larger purpose that had emerged from that initial rejection. "No," he decided, watching as Alessandri surveyed the event with an expression that suggested both surprise and assessment. "That would undermine everything we're doing here. Let's see what they want." He approached the pair with measured steps, aware of the eyes following this potential confrontation, conscious that this interaction would likely become part of the event's narrative in tomorrow's news coverage. "Mr. Alessandri, Ms. Winters," he greeted them with professional courtesy. "I'm surprised to see you here today." Alessandri's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of discomfort and something that might have been respect. Up close, Terry could see the lines of experience etched into his face, the weathering of someone who had built and defended a business empire through decades of economic fluctuations and political landscapes. "Mr. Bolea," he began, his Italian accent more pronounced than Terry had expected. "I came to observe what you've accomplished here. It's impressive." "The community accomplished this," Terry corrected him, gesturing toward the volunteers staffing information booths and the families engaged in educational activities about marine conservation. "I just provided the catalyst." "Perhaps," Alessandri conceded, his gaze sweeping across the gathering. "But it was a strategic catalyst. You've turned a personal slight into a community benefit." He gestured toward the crowd. "These people aren't here because of a wrestling personality. They're here because you identified an issue they care about." The assessment was astute, a recognition of the careful calibration that had gone into the response. The deliberate shift from personal grievance to collective concern. It was the acknowledgement of one strategist to another, a professional respect that transcended their public disagreement. Regina stepped forward, her professional demeanor now tinged with what appeared to be genuine engagement. "We've brought something," she said, nodding toward a Bayside Grill employee approaching with several large catering trays. "Our chef's signature appetizers, as a donation to the event." The gesture wasn't lost on Terry. It represented not necessarily an apology, but an acknowledgement, a recognition of the effectiveness of his response to their rejection. Food, which had been the original point of contention in their conflict, was now being offered as a symbol of potential reconciliation. "There's room for another tent," Terry offered, indicating an empty space among the participating restaurants. "If Bayside would like to join the other establishments supporting coastal conservation." A small crowd had gathered, watching the exchange with interest. Alessandri seemed to weigh his options, aware of the public relations implications. In that moment, Terry recognized the familiar calculation happening behind the developer's eyes, the same assessment of optics and strategic positioning that he himself had been conducting throughout his career. Finally, Alessandri nodded. "We would be honored to participate. And perhaps, Mr. Bolia, when this is over, we might discuss the development project with fresh perspective." As the Bayside staff set up their station, joining the community effort, a local reporter approached Terry, microphone extended and cameraman in tow. "Is this your way of getting revenge on the restaurant that turned you away?" she asked, her question direct, aimed at generating the kind of conflict-driven soundbite that would lead the evening news. Terry considered his response carefully, aware that his answer would frame not just this event, but the ongoing narrative around coastal development and community engagement. The easy answer would be to claim victory, to position Alessandri's participation as a concession. But that framing would diminish what the event had become, something larger than personal vindication. "This isn't about revenge," he replied, gesturing toward the families enjoying the beach, the volunteers collecting donations, the restaurants, including Bayside, serving the community. "It's about finding productive ways to address disagreement. Sometimes being denied a seat at one table means you need to build a bigger table, one where everyone benefits." The reporter seemed momentarily taken aback by the response, having clearly expected something more aligned with his wrestling persona. "And your dispute with Mr. Alessandri over the beach development?" she pressed. "Is ongoing," Terry acknowledged, "but today shows that we can disagree on specific policies while still finding common ground in our shared appreciation for this coastline. The development dispute isn't resolved, but we've established a foundation for dialogue that didn't exist before." As the interview concluded, he watched Alessandri engaging with Elena from the Coastal Conservation Coalition, their conversation appearing surprisingly animated. The unexpected conjunction of forces, a developer known for ambitious projects and an environmental advocate dedicated to preservation, represented exactly the kind of dialogue the event had been designed to foster. The afternoon light began to soften into evening, casting a golden glow over the gathering. What had begun as a response to rejection had evolved into something with momentum of its own, a community catalyst that had brought unexpected allies together and opened conversations that transcended the initial conflict. As Terry moved through the crowd, accepting gratitude from attendees and witnessing connections being forged between previously opposed stakeholders, he recognized that the impact of this response would extend far beyond the news cycle of a restaurant controversy. The tables had turned, but not in the way anyone might have predicted. Rather than escalation leading to further division, a strategic redirection had created space for collaboration. The wrestling ring had taught Terry about choreographed conflict and dramatic resolution. This experience was teaching him, about authentic engagement and the power of redirecting negative energy toward constructive outcomes. As the event began to wind down, with volunteers collecting recyclables and restaurants packing up their stations, Henderson and Choi, the investors who had witnessed the Bayside rejection, approached Terry with extended hands and expressions of genuine admiration. "This," Henderson said, gesturing toward the community dispersing into the evening, "is exactly the kind of social impact initiative our investment group looks to support. You've demonstrated something powerful here." Terry accepted the compliment with a nod, but his attention was drawn to the families lingering on the beach, unwilling to leave, despite the setting sun. They represented what mattered beyond business deals and public relations. The community, whose access to natural beauty had become the centerpiece of what had initially been a personal conflict. 3 months after the Open Shores event, Terry sat at a conference table in downtown Tampa, reviewing architectural plans spread across the polished surface. The boardroom, situated on the 32nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the bay, offered a panoramic view of the coastline that had become the focal point of community engagement following the restaurant incident. That moment of rejection, which had initially stung with its public nature and potential business implications, now seemed like a distant catalyst for the transformation unfolding before him. Across from Terry sat Dominic Alessandri, his posture still carrying the proud bearing of a self-made business magnate, though the combative edge that had characterized their early interactions had softened into something more collaborative. Alongside them were representatives from the City Planning Commission, the Coastal Conservation Coalition, and architectural consultants specializing in environmentally integrated development. "The modified development preserves this entire section as public access," Alessandri explained, indicating a substantial portion of the beachfront property on the blueprints. His Italian accent flowed over the technical terms with practiced ease, his finger tracing the revised boundaries that represented months of negotiation and compromise. "We're still building the residential complex, but with a smaller footprint and a commitment to maintaining environmental standards that exceed the city requirements." The plans represented the culmination of negotiations that had begun that day at the fundraiser, a conversation initiated amidst community celebration that had continued through formal meetings, public forums, and countless revisions. What had initially been positioned as an either-or conflict, development versus preservation, had evolved into a collaborative approach that acknowledged multiple stakeholders' interests. The Open Shores initiative itself had transformed from a one-day event into an ongoing foundation, with Terry serving on its board alongside other community leaders, including, surprisingly, Regina Winters from Bayside Grill. Their initial uncomfortable interaction at the restaurant host's stand had given way to a professional relationship built around shared commitment to community engagement. "The numbers from the impact study look good," noted Elena Vasquez, now the Foundation's executive director, her earlier skepticism about celebrity involvement replaced by pragmatic partnership. She indicated a section of the environmental assessment report. "And the educational center included in the plans will give us a permanent base for conservation programs." The educational center had been Terry's suggestion, a space within the development dedicated to teaching visitors and residents about coastal ecosystems and conservation efforts. It represented his evolving understanding of how his platform could be leveraged for substantive impact rather than mere visibility. As the meeting concluded, with final approvals granted and implementation timelines established, Terry and Alessandri walked together toward the elevators. Their former animosity transformed into a cautious, professional respect. The hallway offered a moment of privacy away from the larger group, an opportunity for reflection on the journey from conflict to collaboration. "You know," Alessandri said as they waited for the elevator, his voice lowered slightly as if sharing a confession, "that night at the restaurant, it was a mistake, a reaction to what I perceived as a threat to my business interests." Terry nodded, recognizing in Alessandri's acknowledgement the same kind of strategic reassessment he himself had engaged in throughout his career. We all make decisions in the heat of the moment. What matters is what we build afterward. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and they stepped inside, the glass wall offering a descending view of the city as they dropped toward the lobby. "You could have escalated," Alessandri observed as they watched Tampa shrink beneath them. "Used your platform to damage my reputation, called for boycotts. It would have been effective. Your reach is considerable." "And what would that have accomplished?" Terry asked, genuinely curious about the developer's assessment. "A short-term victory, perhaps public sympathy, but not this." Alessandri gestured vaguely, encompassing the collaboration they had just concluded. "Not actual change in how the development will proceed." "Sometimes the most effective response isn't the most obvious one," Terry replied. "I learned that lesson many times throughout my career, though not always as gracefully as I should have." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement that the wisdom demonstrated in this situation had been hard-earned through previous conflicts where different choices had led to less constructive outcomes. The elevator reached the lobby, doors opening to the marble expanse where both men had built their respective public images through decades of calculated decisions and strategic positioning. Later that evening, Terry found himself back at Bayside Grill, not as a controversial figure being denied service, but as a welcomed guest, attending the restaurant's fundraising dinner for the Open Shores Foundation. The irony wasn't lost on him, as Regina personally showed him to a table near the window overlooking the bay. The same view he had been denied months earlier, now offered with professional courtesy. The restaurant had been transformed for the evening, with displays highlighting coastal conservation efforts and sustainable seafood practices. What had begun as a response to rejection had influenced even the culinary philosophy of the establishment that had initiated the conflict. Mark joined him at the table, shaking his head with amusement as he surveyed the transformation. "If someone had told me 3 months ago we'd be celebrated guests here, I wouldn't have believed it." "The investment deal with Henderson and Choi closed last week," Terry noted as they settled in. The culmination of the business objective that had initially brought them to Bayside months earlier. They cited the community initiative as a key factor in their decision, said it demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving approach they value in business partners. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with conversation as community members, business leaders, and environmental advocates gathered to support the cause that had emerged from a moment of conflict. On a small stage at the front of the dining room, a banner displayed the foundation's logo alongside photographs from beach cleanup events and educational programs that had already reached thousands of local students. "Mr. Bollier," Regina approached their table with 2 glasses of champagne, her earlier discomfort replaced by professional warmth. "Mr. Alessandri would like to make a toast later this evening, acknowledging your partnership in the Modified Development Project." As Terry accepted the glass, he reflected on the journey from rejection to collaboration. What had begun as a public embarrassment had evolved into something neither he nor Alessandri could have anticipated, a model for community engagement that prioritized shared interests over personal conflicts. The evening progressed with speeches celebrating the Foundation's early achievements, acknowledgements of key contributors, and announcements of future initiatives. Throughout it all, Terry observed the network of relationships that had formed around what had initially been a simple binary conflict: developer versus homeowner, business versus celebrity. The complexity that had emerged, with its overlapping interests and collaborative approaches, represented a more authentic reflection of community dynamics than the oversimplified narratives that often dominated public discourse. As Alessandri concluded his toast, acknowledging the unexpected partnership that emerged from an unfortunate misunderstanding, Terry recognized a truth that extended beyond this specific situation to encompass much of his career in the public eye. Perception could be redirected. Narratives could be reframed, and conflicts could be transformed when approached with strategic vision rather than reactive emotion. Sometimes being turned away from the door, he mused to Mark as they clinked glasses, is just the universe's way of telling you to build something better outside. The evening continued, a testament to how strategic thinking and community focus could transform personal rejection into collective progress, a lesson far more valuable than any meal he might have had at Bayside Grill that first night. The gathering represented not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a collaboration, with implications extending beyond individual reputations to impact the physical landscape of the community and the relationships that defined it. As Terry spoke with various attendees throughout the evening, he found himself engaged in discussions about future projects, ways to expand the foundation's impact, opportunities to apply the collaborative model to other community challenges, possibilities for leveraging his platform for issues beyond coastal conservation. What had begun as a response to a singular incident had opened pathways to ongoing engagement, creating a template for transforming conflict into construction that could be applied across various contexts. The lights of Tampa Bay sparkled beyond the restaurant windows, illuminating the coastline that had become not just the physical location of a development dispute, but the symbolic landscape upon which a new approach to community engagement had been mapped. In that moment, watching the interplay of darkness and light across the water's surface, Terry recognized that the most significant impact of the past 3 months wasn't the modified development plans or even the successful foundation launch. It was the demonstration that strategic response could transform rejection into opportunity, conflict into collaboration, and personal slight into community benefit. The lesson would extend beyond this specific situation, informing not just his future business endeavors, but his understanding of how public influence could be leveraged for substantive impact. The wrestling ring had taught him about playing to an audience. This experience had taught him about engaging with a community. The distinction was subtle but profound, a shift from performance to participation that represented perhaps the most meaningful evolution of his decades in the public eye.